To begin our discussion, one of the most basic ideas behind retail, especially when it comes to setting up your store, is the importance of location, location, location. And this is a really common phrase and idea that you often hear a lot in everyday language and popular culture. And the reason is that it is of so much truth, especially when it comes to business. When we talk about location in terms of a retailer, we're referring to the site and the facility where the business is physically situated. And of course, this is a very traditional definition of a location because that's constantly changing now with the advent of multi-channel retailing. So the choices you have for where you can locate, so to speak, your business are growing all the time. So you could use something as traditional as a mall, or you could even, some retailers are now choosing to convert abandoned warehouse spaces into a store, or sometimes even reclaimed historical landmarks. And it kind of adds to that novelty and notoriety that a retailer brings to their brand and their image. And then you also have that obvious offshoot of e-commerce and online locations. And there's another important idea as we start out our discussion that's important to clarify. So there's a difference between spending money on a location versus a site. And we're going to define what those two things mean shortly in more detail. But the reason that this matters is because there's a lot of retailers, especially if you're a smaller boutique, that will elect to not choose a certain location in terms of where it's located in a physical space or in a certain town, etc. And then they spend their money on outfitting their store with fixtures and lots of visual merchandising props. And so they still go forward and spend a lot of money. But even if you set up your store to have a successful interior, it's not likely going to matter unless you've chosen a location that will be profitable and have traffic. So no matter how beautiful you make your store, if people aren't coming in, it's not going to be very successful for you. So that's the difference when we talk about location versus site. And that's why it's important for us to cover all of these different elements of what location is, because there's key differences with how you regard this in the setup of a retailer. And also the maintenance of a retailer as well when you think about expanding to multiple locations. The first consideration that you have to take with a retail location is geographic location. And the geographic location, even though it might not seem like it, really helps to set the image of the retailer. So you have this obvious idea of location being related to convenience with regard to physical proximity to your target market. But other considerations are going to include things like how your name relates to the location that it's in, or the sites, such as, do you plan to be downtown or do you plan to be in a mall? And that's going to be affected by the geographic location choices that you make. There's been a lot of research done where shoppers can often recall the name of a mall before they can recall the name of a store. So that's one example of how the geographic location you choose can set the image. Also, with regard to geographic location, you have the ultimate goal of positioning your business at a site, that should be site, not size, that will best serve the needs of your target market. So you are not thinking fully in terms of you as the retailer. Yes, you factor into it, but your primary goal is to serve your target market. So they should be your first consideration. To characterize how you make these decisions, we have this geographic location pyramid. So you start by considering the region. That's the most important, working from the bottom up. And then you notice that these categories get more specific as you move up. So then you consider the state that's within the region, and then the community that's in the state, and then the actual site within the community. Of course, this pyramid is taking into account the United States, and there are international considerations that many retailers take as well, depending on the size. And so you could translate this same thing by adding more categories onto the bottom for international retailing. You could add things like country, continent, etc. So let's talk about each of these levels of our geographic location pyramid. So the first is your region. And when we talk about region, we're really talking about analyzing certain areas that have the greatest number of characteristics that are favorable for your business. So you're starting really quite broad, as that lowest level suggests. And we have a list of characteristics that go along with this particular level. The first is, what is the growth level of particular population segments? So is there a broad enough population segment that fits your target market available in the region? And related to the population segments, you also have things like disposable income. One thing that many retailers look out for when they're choosing a region is what areas have rising disposable incomes. Because that means that their economic condition is constantly increasing or improving, and that bodes well for spending power. So that connects directly to the stable economic environment, because, as we just said, disposable income is really related to what the economic environment in a region is. So you don't necessarily want to go for an economic environment that is deprived or declining, because spending power is going to be lower. You also need to make sure when you choose a region that you have access to suppliers. We've been talking a lot about how you obtain merchandise and source it and where you go. Well, to have access to vendors and different trade shows to get your merchandise, you want to make sure that you have some type of proximity to it and ease of access. If you don't mind traveling some, that's fine, but you don't want it to be too out of reach or too unattainable in terms of a sales rep. With region, based on economic environment, there's also things like operating costs. So that can relate directly to the economy, but it can also just relate to the resources that a certain region is known for and what they have available. So you want to know if the operating costs are going to outweigh the profit that you make, because that's going to decrease your margins. And then you have low levels of competition to watch out for as well. You don't want to go into a market in a region that has a lot of saturation. So a lot of businesses catering to the same target market selling similar product. That likely won't lead to the level of success that you wish to have. And so either you have to find a way to differentiate yourself, or you need to seek out other regions. And then lastly, you have climate. So this one might seem like a no-brainer, but it's one that a lot of retailers have to take into account very consciously, because there's always going to be a certain subset in each location that wants a product, but is it a big enough part of the population to warrant having a location there? So for example, if you want to do a custom-made swimwear retailer, you likely aren't going to situate yourself in Michigan. You'd probably look for places in California and Florida or other areas where you have warmth like Arizona. So those are considerations related to region. And then we have state considerations. One of the things that all retailers should ideally do when they're looking into locating within a state is connect with the business development office that's associated with local government. This office can give a lot of opportunity information with regard to any types of state laws that you need to follow, any type of trade regulations if you're sourcing merchandise from other regions or internationally, and also any applicable business taxes, including sales tax. So that can affect how you locate as well. For example, in Oregon, we have no sales tax on anything here. So a lot of people flock here to buy high-end merchandise and cars because there's no sales tax, and that can shave off a lot of money if you're buying things that have a higher price tag. So the outlet malls are a destination for people that are tourists in Oregon for that reason. And then you also want to look at your prospective workforce. You want to know, how much am I expected to pay my employees? Are the employees unionized? And how many people am I going to be able to look at in terms of the quantity of a workforce? So are there a lot of people competing for jobs? Is there a high unemployment rate? You need to get a sense of all of those workforce factors. The next consideration is one that repeats from region. So again, proximity to suppliers and sales reps is key. You want to make sure that you have the proximity that you want and need. And then lastly, your general business and economic climate. So how is the state doing just basically overall? And again, the Business Development Office and different types of taxation and revenue offices in state government can help you to find out that information. Then we go one more level up to community. And community is where it starts to get much more specific in terms of what you are expected to know to be successful. The first place you want to start, because now you're talking about a more specific location, is the population. And typically when you talk about community, we're talking about defining that as a city or a town. We've talked at length over the semester about psychographics and demographics, and this is a time when those characteristics of an entire city or town are of utmost importance to the retailer. So you want to know how are the age groups divided out? What's the percentage of males versus females, retirees versus young professionals, things like that. And you also, connected to population, you want to look at different statistics related to the population composition. So this includes growth trends and what we call population density. And population density, by definition, is the number of people per square mile in a given area. So, for example, the reason that density is important is, let's say that you have customers of a leather goods store in a town, and they're likely going to live or work about 8 to 10 miles away from the store. And this is a pretty good radius. But if a sufficient number of residents within this target market do not fit into this range, it may not matter how desirable your merchandise is, because you don't have that radius and density to fit the desired target market within the population. An example of a really notable growth in terms of cities is Atlanta, Georgia. They are on the rise in terms of fashion retailers because they have a huge growth rate of high-income young professionals. They now have a population that's approximately 30% ages 20 to 39. And so there's a lot of retailers that are vying for their attention because they know that makes up a significant portion of the population. And then we move on to the consideration of competition. Now, in our previous levels with the pyramid, we considered competition, but again, this is where it gets more specific. So you want to look at the number and quality of your competitors, again, referring to the saturation of the market. Is there too many catering to the same merchandise and the same market? There's also some deeper things you want to look at as well. So differences and similarities in the merchandise that you offer are important. So maybe you're catering to the same target market and offer similar merchandise, but there might be a key difference that you can capitalize on. and that might set you apart. You also want to look at, if you're offering similar merchandise, what's the price difference? Are they offering it for more, less, or the same that you intend to? And then lastly, and this is a very key consideration, so if any of you are ever considering opening your own business, the success and failure rates of retail businesses in that particular site is very important to know. Because if someone else has come before you and not done well, you want to know that so that you can either decide to go elsewhere or differentiate yourself accordingly. And then we get to site. So this is our last level. And as we talked about earlier at the start of our discussion, site is when we get into the specifics of a city or town. So where exactly are you physically locating within that particular designation? We usually refer to site as a physical location for your business operation, but also remember, if you are an off-site retailer, that might mean that you have an online presence instead. For the purposes of our discussion, we're going to continue talking about site as a physical location for now, and then on Thursday we'll talk more about off-site location considerations. As you know, when we talked at the start of the semester about the different types of retailers, there are just as many different choices when it comes to different sites that you can select from. So I want to talk about those site choices in more detail. But before we talk about the specific types of sites that you can select from, there's a series of considerations that you want to take into account when you're choosing a brick and mortar location. And remember that brick and mortar is the physical location as a type of retailer. So that's a more specific retail terminology word that we can insert instead of just a physical site. The first consideration that you need to take into account when you're choosing brick and mortar is analysis of the trading area. And what we mean by this is how far a customer will travel to a particular store. How far a customer will travel depends upon the drawing power of the store. So, for example, is it a well-known brand? And this is also dependent upon a customer's need for the specific merchandise that the retailer offers. So the place from which you can expect your customers to come from or travel from is called your trading area. So when we refer to the term trading area, we're talking about the area from which you can expect your customers to come from. And the size of your trading area is going to differ greatly based on many different factors associated with the retailer. So some companies are going to have very large trading areas because of the nature of the product that they offer, and perhaps even the exclusivity of the product. So if it's something that's very unique and only has maybe 1 or 2 locations, you're going to have a much larger trading area. A good example of this is LL Bean. So they're actually based in Freeport, Maine as their flagship store. And their store, because that's where they were founded, occupies 1 square block of physical space in Freeport. It's a huge flagship. And you have shoppers that come from all over, including down from Canada and from Europe, who will shop at this store because they have the most up-to-date LL Bean merchandise at this location. The same is also true of stores like Nike and Columbia here in Oregon. Because they're headquartered in Portland, they have the most up-to-date merchandise right away. And so they have quite a large drawing or trading area with people from Canada to the north of us. When you have a very large trading area, you have what's known as a destination location. So this is when you have a retail location that a shopper is going to seek out, even if it's out of their way. So that's the key difference between a regular trading area and a destination location, is if someone is willing to go out of their way, it's a destination. And destination could mean any variety of distances. So it could be something that's only an hour away from you. It could be something that's a plane ride. But if you're willing to go out of your way, destination. So malls actually tend to have smaller trading areas because they're so concentrated that they cater more to specific areas within a community or a region. But then you also have some malls that are destination locations, such as the Mall of America. So the type of site that you have could have several different types of trading areas depending upon the size and the nature of the site. One of the things that a lot of retailers do is they use software, like you see in the image on the far right of the screen, to determine trade areas within any region or community. So in this case, what we're seeing in this graphic is the trade area based on the concentration of retail businesses spans out around that green area as a radius and outside of the state in which you have the concentration of retailers. So it can span multiple states as well. And we're going to start our discussion of different types of sites, but there's also population that we have to consider first. So the income level of your population is one thing that you need to be aware of before you determine your final site for location. This is the most important consideration when it comes to determining your location. Because you want to offer merchandise that the population is interested in, but you also want to make sure that they can actually buy it, that it's attainable. This is important from a financial standpoint as well, because you don't want to gamble your investment or your company's money on an economically deprived area. So there's different perspectives from which you can consider the population considerations. Another aspect of population is the different needs of different age groups. So remember, as we talked about with psychographics and demographics, that there's going to be different needs and buying preferences among groups. For example, a retirement community is not going to need professional wear sold to them. And young professionals are generally going to choose merchandise that offers them status and some type of element related to fast fashion. And you can create any number of distinctions between age groups and buying preferences in those ways. So you'll want to think about that with regard to your simulated stores as well. Occupations is another important aspect of population. Think about the amount of time, maybe not right now because you're in school, but as a professional, once you get into the working world, the amount of time that you spend in your work clothes. That is a huge proportion of the time that you spend wearing clothes. So you have to research the different expectations for dress, for occupations in the area that you wish to locate. Because you're not going to want to create a lot of really professional merchandise offerings if you have more widely accepted casual dress codes. Then you have marital status and gender. The key difference for marital status and gender is spending patterns. So there has been research that supports the idea that single individuals will spend more money when they go out and shop at retailers. The idea of household permanency is one that we haven't talked about much yet. And this is when you have considerations related to how much of the year a population resides in a community. So, do you have a high level of permanency? Or are you maybe in a college town where 3, 4, 5 months out of the year, the population lowers because students are out of town? Or maybe you're in a town like Orlando, Florida, or city, I should say, where it's a resort area. And so you constantly have turnover of the population because it's primarily meant for tourists. The key idea here is that if you spend a lot of time investing in a site that has a low permanency, like a resort area, people that are on vacation tend to spend their money more freely. And so that could be a consideration when you're deciding how to price your merchandise. And also the quality and exclusivity of merchandise that you offer. And then lastly on our list is religious affiliation. We often think about religious affiliation in terms of only the merchandise that you stock, but there's also considerations related to how you operate your store. For example, if you were to locate your retailer in a community that has a large population of Orthodox Jews, their Sabbath day is on Saturday, which is often a high-selling retail day of the week. But they do not shop on Saturdays, and they don't look favorably upon businesses that are open that day because of their beliefs. And so you would have to consider if Saturday is important to you as a selling day. And if it is, think about other options that you might have. So this is going to be our last slide for today. We're going to just start our discussion of types of brick and mortar sites. The first is downtown central districts. And this is just basically when you have a retailer that's in a well-known and historic area of a town or a city. So you guys in Manhattan, you have the downtown area that caters to you in many ways because you have Aggieville down there, closer to downtown. So this is a very common area for retailers to locate because people know that populations tend to settle when they go for entertainment and social activities in more central districts. And then you have regional malls. One of the main differences between a downtown district and a regional mall is the level of crowding and whether it's enclosed or not. Oftentimes, a downtown district will just be exterior storefronts that you enter, and a regional mall can be more enclosed. You also have malls being more crowded in terms of density than your central downtown districts. So oftentimes people will go shop downtown, not only because they want to support local business, but also because they want to get away from crowded malls. The main draw of a regional mall is to house major retailers and then smaller ones within a large shared structure of some kind. And this is one of the most long-standing and traditional ways for retailers to locate. Malls really began with the idea of what's known as a controlled shopping center. And this is the idea that instead of just allowing anyone to rent space in the mall, that competition was just controlled by limiting the types of retailer. So for example, they would limit the number of shoe retailers or the number of dress retailers. And this was meant to enhance the probability that each store could turn a profit. So it was a very kind of warm and fuzzy idea for retailing, that let's have a kumbaya moment and we all can have a piece of the pie. But you don't really see controlled shopping centers anymore. It's kind of more of a savage, we're all in it for ourselves and you get what you get. And if I get there first, so be it. The other difference you see in malls now compared to historical differences is that malls are much more of an entertainment complex now than they originally were. The original idea behind the mall was that you would go and shop in a retail setting. Now you have things like movie theaters and food courts. There are people that can spend an entire day in a mall because you have all of these opportunities. And one of the things that has been long-standing with malls and continues today as a draw is what's known as a mall anchor. So this is what ultimately draws shoppers into the mall, despite having things like movie theaters and food courts. You have your well-known, usually department store branches that have immediate name and brand recognition. So these are going to be stores that take up a much larger portion of the mall space. So things like Macy's and JCPenney, and at one time Sears, Nordstrom. And related to the idea of anchor points, not only are stores now an anchor, but also those entertainment aspects. Some people now go to the mall, and have for several years, just to socialize and do something other than shop. And so that can be considered an anchor in its own way. There's this phenomenon of mall walkers now. People that they form walking groups, or they go by themselves, and they just walk around the mall for a workout. So you've got this retail aspect, you've got entertainment, and now you've got this added social benefit. So there's these sort of secondary ways to use the mall, but it's all centered around the idea that it's contained in one central area. Lastly, for today, you can have a classification of a brick and mortar site within an inner city area. So this is when you are specifically attempting to revitalize an economically deprived area of a town or a city. Now this might sound a little bit like it's going against what we talked about before, because we had discussed that retail will often function better if you go where the money is, so when people have income. But if you develop with a specific plan in mind to revitalize an area, you might want to do that in combination with other retailers in a site. It can be very possible to turn it around economically. New York City is one area where this has been done very successfully. And there's been several areas in Harlem that are now functioning as very fashionable retail sites.